I'm going to speak predominantly about my work in Australia. I'll kind of go through a few projects quickly and then delve a bit deeper into the work I'm presenting here. I've basically, as Shrishti mentioned, my practice kind of has moved between Kashmir and Australia, and in both those contexts largely looking at the violences that nation states produce, the fragilities of nation states that often lead to that kind of violence, the way that colonisation unfolds in daily life, and the anxieties and the absurdities that underpin these kinds of things. I'm going to speak a little bit about, before I get into the work, a bit about how I work to help bring you into what I'm doing. I don't come to my practice really as a photographer, which is a little bit different to everyone here, but I do have an interest in journalism, which has kind of underpinned some of the things I've done. I've titled the work Exactitude and Intuition because I think they're two terms that have been resonating in my mind recently. And one is the need to be clear and to work with precision, also to be accountable for the things that we do with the people and places that we hold dear. And I think this idea of actitude, the term was suggested to me by someone who was looking at a number of things I'd done and the use of numbers and kind of specific things which I hadn't recognised the repetition of that in my own practice before they mentioned that to me just last month. And also with the idea, I was in Delhi a few months ago speaking about Kashmir a few times, and somebody had said to me that I should be more nuanced in the way I was speaking, and it kind of threw me, and I was thinking, okay, how can I be more nuanced? What does that mean? And, you know, over a few weeks of kind of stewing on that, it made me actually not want to be nuanced. It made me want to be precise. And yeah, I think that's important. I like the word nuanced as well, but I think in this context it was coming from a particular place. But kind of as a counter to that, I think intuition is really important in the process of art making and following things that we might not know the end result of it all, and kind of respecting imagination and being open to the unknown places that what we're doing might lead to, and also to think about need, which sometimes the things we need can be something completely absurd or outlandish or not necessarily functional, but I think need is something that underpins what I do as well. So I mentioned that I don't really come from a background in formal photography, but I do these forms of social practice and kind of relational or conceptual practices do kind of form the ground that my work comes from. But, you know, unlike, I think there's a vein within social practice that tends to kind of say that you should build relationships with a community in order to make art. And kind of to flip that, like, I think my work comes from relationships that are already existing in life around me. And so the work that I'm making springs from the people and places that I've encountered and that I have lived alongside in many ways. And this means, like, particularly through my life in Australia, I've been I actually kind of don't like the term consultation or community very much, and I prefer to think of a more anarchic and lived sense of relationships, intuition, accountability, imagination, need, and also time in relation to artistic practice. And there's this Maori lawyer called Moana Jackson who passed away last year, but he said that you don't consult with people who are equal to you. You negotiate with people who are equal, and that often the process of consultation already has the end goal in mind, and it's just a bit of a tick box process or something. And I think you'll see as my work goes on and its engagement with development, but I see this particularly where I've lived in the northwest of Australia, that sort of superficial stream of consultation running through the arts and the government's approach to development as well. So I mentioned time as well. I often work quite slowly over many years in different ways that Shrishti kind of alluded to in the bio a bit. I used to feel quite bad about how slow I was working, but over time I came to trust that and also really appreciate what a kind of the kind of brewing that time can give to a work and the thickening of it, what that can do. But it's not just time for me, it's not just about durations of time, but also moments in time that shape a work, or that even moments in time that our work might shape, even if in very small ways. Probably the core question that underpins how I work, like that keeps coming up, is how can I find the most effective ways for my work to move in the world? So how can I help it to circulate? Like what forms of distribution? How can I try to give life to a work? Or even lay the seeds for the work to take on a life of its own? And by that, I really mean like, how can we try to produce work that resonates with people in ways that matter? And in that sense, like I definitely think of the art world as one avenue for my work, but I really try to think of other avenues outside of the art world as well, and really think of how do we make our work move in the world in the broadest sense possible. And so often the social space between people is a place that I like to think about, and also the public sphere and having work move between those places. So now going into my work in Australia, I just want to say as well, we can please ask questions at any point, and we can also discuss things at the end, and don't feel... I'm open to any kind of questions that people might have today. So I would say over the last 12 years, I've been living on Gidja and Mirrawong countries in the northwest of Australia, which is this area that says the Kimberley Plateau, and there's a body of water there that's actually an artificial dam that we'll get to. My relationships in this place with Gidja and Mirrawong people have really profoundly shaped how I've seen my own non-Indigenous culture in this place. And my work, as a result of that, really tries to examine contemporary colonial culture, shift the lens onto that, and highlight colonisation in this part of the world not as history, but as a continuum in the present moment, something that we're all kind of embedded in. So that's obviously a map of Australia drawn up by from the lens of kind of a colonial culture that dominates it. This is an Indigenous nations map of the region, including Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, Timor and New Zealand, among other places. It was made by Matt Chun, an artist in Australia, as part of a collaborative project with James Tyler. But that just gives a bit of an overview. I'm just going to read a quote here. 1 second. I'm just going to read this to kind of ground the work I'm about to get into. But this is by an Indigenous author named Amberlyn Quay-Molina, and it's the opening of a book that she's written called Living on Stolen Land. So she says, "You are on Indigenous land, swimming in Indigenous waters, looking up at Indigenous skies. There is no part of this place that was not, is not, cared for, loved by an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander nation. There are no trees, rivers, hills, stars that were not and are not someone's kin." So this is a map of the town that I've been living in for a number of years now. And it was only established in the 1960s and 70s through the construction of a large dam. As you can kind of see by this aerial view, the kind of physical imprint of colonisation running along that river and through the kind of segmenting of land there, it's quite like it confronts you visually every day there, and it feels it's a very remote place. So the nearest major towns are over 1,000 kilometres away. So it almost feels like this little island of a colony in the middle of a vast landscape as well. Crime in this part of Australia, particularly over the last couple of months, but also in a longer term, is really framed around the problem of Indigenous youth committing crimes. But I often feel that all of the press, the media, and the kind of community debates around this miss the fact that non-Indigenous settlement in this place is what lies at the heart of the crime scene here. And this is what my work kind of tries to examine. The town itself is very racially divided as well, and not a smooth place to be in, I would say. This is the site of the largest non-nuclear explosion in Australian history, where they blew up a dam in the early 1960s. They blew up a mountain in the early 1960s to produce a dam that drowned huge tracts of Mirrawong country and is 22 times at least larger than all of Sydney Harbour. So this dam is visited today by locals and tourists alike, and the dam is really the birth of colonial settlement in this region. So the dam was constructed in order to enable industrial agriculture, which then enabled the colonial settlement of this place in the 60s and 70s. This is an image from the 1940s of Kimberley Land, who's a descendant of the first European family to open up this region for cattle farming. And it was his vision to dam the region when the cattle industry was dwindling and it was very sparsely populated. So the dam has kind of enabled a much larger influx of non-Indigenous people in a much more permanent way than the cattle industry did. And the idea for the dam actually came from some Jewish people who were looking for a homeland in the late 1930s. And this region was actually proposed as a kind of Jewish homeland, but it didn't materialise for a number of reasons. And obviously Israel took root in Palestine. But I found this image really striking because it's kind of, you can almost feel him thinking, like looking at those waters and like that impetus to kind of, if only I could control these waters which come as a big monsoon once a year, and if he could hold that water and that sort of colonial mentality to control that, really birthed the construction of the dam, I'd asked the local historical society if I could use this in an exhibition in 2018, and they told me no, on the basis that they were concerned that I was going to create a myth out of the history, particularly, which was absurd to me, because the sort of colonial myth that the colonial historical narrative that they like to nurture is really like the grandest myth of all. So I sort of got blacklisted by the local historical society, but that prompted me to, one, start working with 35mm film as a way to sort of blur the line between the past and the present, and also to restage some photographs. So this is not a restaged image. This is kind of the centerpiece of a body of work called Faith in a Pile of Stones, which points to the absurdity of our faith in this very fragile balancing act of the dam wall is literally a mountain exploded and balancing on each other. And I guess there's this assumed certainty that it will last forever. It's lasted 50 years right now, but what 50 years means in relation to kind of the edge of that mountain that it's wedged between, which is, millions of years old, is kind of these two collisions of different times. And that bus has a tiny map of Australia. But this is another archival photograph you can see a bigger view of the exploded mountain, the dam wall, and then the dam itself and how far it goes. But I decided to restage these. As part of the work Faith in a Pile of Stones. And this was actually shown in 2019 with Sarkot Protik in Sydney. So that was when I first met him. I'll just go a little bit try to go swiftly through here so I have time. And then I installed this street sign at the base of the dam wall, which, we didn't have permission to put it there, but it lasted about 2 years before it got taken down a little while ago. And actually, there is a little hashtag on Instagram if you search Faith in a Pile of Stones, and you'll find a couple of photos of tourists and stuff taking those images. But I think that people kind of come to this place with a sense of wonder and appreciating the beauty of this epic body of water, but they kind of miss the genocide that underpins it all. These are images just accumulating things that I work on the side, again, just picking up on physical transgressions into the landscape of a kind of developmental colonial culture. And a tourist bus, this image is in the show over at Patton House. And some more tourists here down at the base of the dam wall. So this next work kind of stems from thinking about people moving into this place. And I'll just read this other quote quickly from Evelyn Araluen, who's another young Indigenous author who wrote an essay called Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie in the Ghost Gum. She writes, "Do you know what laws I have had to learn while you play in everything they protect? Do you understand that when you write the kangaroo, the wallaby, the bilby, the bandicoot, the cockatoo, the black snake, the water lily, the brush, the bush, the sapling, the ghost gum, that you are puppeting your hands through ancestors, through relations?" So that when I was making this next work, All the Violence Within and in the National Interest, I came across that quote, which really captured what I was trying to produce here. This image is another archival image from the local historical society of people picnicking in the early 1960s in a cave. I'm not sure you can see, but there's rock art on the roof and background here. So this basically was a home for Indigenous people of the area that became a picnic destination for the colonists. And this image really turned my gut because, up until the late 1950s, neck chains were used in this region on Indigenous prisoners, and the last massacre in the region took place in the mid-1920s. So these kind of picnicking comes with that historical weight, and the selective ignorance or decision not to kind of acknowledge that. So, and this quest for kind of one person's quest for home, for quality of life, like at the expense of another person's, a whole society's. So I produced these images where I photographed tourists at a spring near where I live. And this work was called All the Violence Within. And it's about that sort of trespassing onto Indigenous land, the sense of entitlement and greed to kind of have this landscape. And the kind of confidence with which people move through these places. And also the awkwardness of bodies in that space as well was something I was really interested in, and this kind of displacement and this balancing act and these things. The flip side of the light boxes in this exhibition contained images of small-scale mining of gravel pits that dot the highways where I live, and these feel like really little but persistent incursions into the landscape and extractions from that country, and they're often done without the proper sort of consultations with Indigenous people, and they feel like, to me, like these cigarette burns, like piercing this landscape, like small but persistent kind of across the body. And I'm interested in these places that aren't often really looked at or acknowledged. So this is just a quote. I can go past that, but more images there of these mines. And then, so I showed these images, but often in that exhibition, I do feel that there's a lot that I want to say within an image, and I'm really curious about what they also bring to mind in people who see these works as well. So I did produce a series of conversations around this work with a number of different interlocutors that were people, some were very close to me, some were slightly less close, but they all kind of form this constellation of people and work that also underpin how I work and what's influencing my work. So we did a series of conversations that were published on the gallery's website at Carriage Works in Sydney, and then eventually I brought them together into a small artist book. And yes. Okay, so now a very clear picture is the body of work that I've presented parts of here. And it is going a bit more into 3 sites around where I live and also 1 form of legislation. This is the construction of a bridge that the Australian government's, both state and federal, teamed together and invested over $100 million in building this bridge that was going to the destination this bridge is heading towards was going to be one of the largest prawn farms in the world, but it only ever existed as an idea. and just a few weeks ago it was cancelled entirely and deemed unviable. But the bridge and the road now exist to this place. And so here I'm just thinking about, one, the role that roads play in kind of becoming these veins and enablers of ongoing colonisation, but also the absurdity in the government's kind of investment in this, continual investment in this dream of kind of developing the north of Australia, and making it profitable and making it, these big grand economic proposals keep getting repeated since the 60s and 70s where I live. They keep getting huge amounts of subsidies and they keep kind of failing. They tried to grow rice in the region where we are, and the local birds pulled the rice sprouts out quicker than they could grow, and so that was abandoned. They tried like sugar, but the production wasn't viable because there wasn't enough industrial kind of infrastructure in place. And there's all these stories of things kind of failing. So the kind of absurdity of this prawn farm, which was going to take place on land like this where people go fishing and have connections to that place as well. Over the last few years, I've been an artist in residence with the Kimberley Land Council, which is an Indigenous land rights organisation. And I've been working with lawyers there, trying to understand more about some of the laws that enable the expansion of colonisation. So particularly the West Australian Aboriginal Heritage Act, which was established in 1972. And it was established with the pretense of protecting Aboriginal heritage, and it made it illegal to destroy, damage or alter an Indigenous site. But Section 18 of this legislation is basically this PDF form that you can fill in to get legal exemption to destroy, damage or alter an Indigenous site. So it's actually like legislation that, claims to protect Indigenous heritage, but actually provides a pathway for its destruction. So since it was implemented in 1972, over 3,300 applications have been processed, but out of that, only 3 have ever been declined. So it's basically like, just a legal pathway towards something that is apparently illegal but isn't. And I think there's a lot of laws that operate like that. So this is just an image for some context of how these sort of consultations take place out on country and plans to kind of develop things out there. In 2019, the site of some Gidja people that I've worked with and our friends was damaged really badly by granite mining. We'd worked on a number of art projects, and in particular this book, which was Gungan Constellations of Meaning, which was an examination of the moon dreaming story and how that travels across different parts of Gidja country. And this granite that has been sliced up is actually heavily connected to that site. So a lot of people were really upset when this mining happened, and we started a small campaign to try and stop it. It did eventually get declared illegal because this mining company hadn't properly applied for a Section 18, but it is one of the 3 that has been declined through that process. And this was how I started learning about this legislation, when it impacted some people that I knew. This is the site of that mining. Yeah, and it actually, someone that I know, the late Rusty Peters, was a senior custodian for this place, and he died not long after this mining took place. And many people say because of the crushing heartache that the destruction of this place kind of did to him, and the deep stress that concerned. So I always think about that in relation to these images and the way that they came and kind of sliced through this country with such reckless abandon or confidence and arrogance. And this is a lot of us went out there to visit this site after it had happened. And I don't often, this is quite a personal image. I don't really share, you'll see in my work, I don't depict Indigenous people in my work. I shift the lens other places. But yeah, this is the examples of the ministerial decisions around Section 18. So I've got hundreds of pages of this from 2010 to 2020. And this column under purpose is how I created this video. So it's a video made in PowerPoint and kind of made to replicate the visual language of these kind of ministerial bureaucracies. And the video details the 967 project summaries that were processed between 2010 and 2020. So I made the video. I shared it with people at the Kimberley Land Council, and some of them, when I was producing this, I was always thinking really of a non-Indigenous audience in mind, and really wanting them to sort of recognise that it's not just mining that damages country, but these documents reveal that it's every aspect of our daily lives. Like there's a residential estate there, a national prayer assembly camp, a naturescape discovery and learning experience. So these 967 summaries, a lot of them are mining, but a lot of them are really seemingly kind of benign aspects of like building a footpath. And I wanted to kind of illustrate through this that it really is every aspect of our lives. When I showed it to people at the Kimberley Land Council, the chairman said, "This is great, but some of our old people, like senior Indigenous people, can't necessarily read very well. And so is there a kind of way that you can make this more legible to Indigenous people as well?" And so that got me thinking about audio, and I realised that I really wanted someone who had been involved in writing one of these submissions, to read all of the submissions and to kind of feel the weight of that. So I was searching around for various people, and someone suggested I asked Sam Walsh, who's the former CEO of Rio Tinto and had a 25-year career with that mining company, which ended in him being CEO. So I asked him if he would read the video, and I got him at an interesting point. I'll try and speak a bit faster, where he agreed. He'd retired, and in his retirement he'd become critical of this legislation because he saw how flawed it was, and I guess also his work was no longer invested in it. So he read, I asked him to read over 2 hours and 41 minutes without pausing every summary in this video. When he first read it, when I asked him, I wanted it to be without pause because I wanted to capture any mistakes that he might have, like any hesitations, any feeling that he might that might come out of him over the course of this 2 hours, the exhaustion and all of that. He actually read like very, very well. And I realised also that that's kind of a characteristic of the confidence and the expertise of him, I guess, as a kind of CEO of a huge international mining company, a white kind of older male with all of the sort of privilege of money and power that comes with. So I'll just play a little excerpt for us to listen to.
Construction of the East Mine Pit. Extension of the Y and Lewis pits. Development of the Brockman 4 mine. Wellington Square enhancement. Century Avenue road widening project. Repairs and future maintenance to Bridge 934 on Amherst Road.
Also throughout the video he often, and he told me he might do this,
Brinduli South Expansion Project.
he skips over the Indigenous words of things just because he wasn't confident pronouncing them as well.
Wannerup North Mineral Sands Project.
And yeah, some of them are quite
Mesa
short.
C Facade. Mesa B and C Stage 6 activities associated with the development and operation of an iron ore open cut mine. Bridge 4524 Glen Road Mundaring replacement, future upgrades and maintenance.
So that will give you an idea. I'll just come back to this. View full screen. So while he read in the recording studio, I was thinking I'd go on the side of the audio engineer, but then Sam asked me to stay in the studio with him, next to him. And I didn't really plan it, but I started just writing on scraps of paper that I had like this, a word or phrase from everything that he was reading. And this became kind of a documentation of his narration in that moment. And this is what I called a very clear picture, because for me it kind of paints a very clear picture of our colonial present, but it's also obscures it as well, which I think is what happens in general. So in the exhibition space in Pattern, I've blown these up to a very large scale, but the originals are just A4, and I did an edition because he's reading 967 summaries, so I did an edition of 967 photocopies of this text. The mine site, the granite mine site, was eventually declared illegal by the government, and when we visited it, it had been abandoned. And I've got these images from a series of the site abandoned. They really just sort of fled. And I think it's interesting the confidence with which they were slicing and extracting the granite, and then also the confidence with which they fled, but the anxiety of fleeing so quickly that you leave behind things still very much lived in. They left behind all that evidence. And I do think there's something there characteristic of kind of colonial culture, is that mix of like obtuse confidence and this flip side of fear as well, and anxiety around that. So this is the site, and this is now sitting there, abandoned there. So again, just thinking about ways to take this work into the world. We did a little sharing of work in progress in Broome, which is the nearest town, like 1,000 k's from where I am, in a friend's house. And we held a discussion there with a lot of people around these sorts of issues. I also was thinking, okay, what can I do with this video now? And so the regional airports across Western Australia are places that a lot of the people working in this realm of development pass through, flying in and flying out. So I thought I could, maybe there's often TVs in these airports. I could ask every airport if they would be interested in screening my Section 18 video called 967 on the airport TVs. And I wrote to all of these airports that are highlighted on that map, and pretty much got no response, or I got a response that you'll need to talk to our advertising department, or we don't control what's on the TVs. But then when I asked them, who decides what channel it's on, and I wouldn't get further replies. But that's okay. I'm also just interested in the idea of the proposition in my work as well, and things don't always have to materialise. But even that kind of process of sending the email, that brief correspondence, or the stilted correspondence is kind of interesting for me, and just putting things out there as a possibility. The Kimberley Land Council also held an event in Broome, and I think where they invited local Indigenous dancers to perform alongside the film and with Sam's narration there. This event was the first sort of trial, and I don't live in Broome. I've been living in Kununurra, and so I very much felt like I didn't know this community very well, so I was just it's also a space where sort of contemporary art doesn't really go very often. So I just really let my work slip into the community framework that was already there, I guess. And it was an interesting evening. In the town that I live in, we held another event where we screened the film at the Kununurra Picture Gardens on a very large screen, and then invited some local Wurundjeri dancers who I know very well and had been speaking about this work over a few years with them to come and dance a particular form of dance, Wonga and Lirga, in response to the video. And this style of dance has a lot of energy to it, and like a real kind of cheeky spirit as well, and a call and response thing going. And so it was a proposition also for them to respond to the film, but with the idea of also drowning out Sam's narration with their own song and dance. And yeah, it was quite an interesting evening, and it went on for over an hour, their performance next to this video. And yeah, the next phase of this work, under Freedom of Information, I've accessed a number of applications to try and understand and examine more closely the language that is being used to orchestrate these forms of violences, which appear really clean on paper, but they're wreak havoc in the world. And, I'm representing very physical infrastructural incursions in the landscape here. But I guess infrastructures can be psychological as well as physical, and this region of Australia also has the highest suicide rates out of anywhere in the world, and for me there's a connection between these things. So I'm extracting the language. This is just a small excerpt, but I'm extracting the language used in these applications and putting them into alphabetical order to look at what's being repeated, what are the kind of how language is being used, how it might be subverted, how it's being emptied of meaning as well in these processes. And this is just a small section. It's going to be sort of hundreds of or thousands of words long when I compile all of the freedom of information material I've gathered. And I still don't really know what form this will take, whether it will be a video or print or a mix or, you know, a zine or a book or I really don't know how I will materialize this, but that's kind of the next step.